Romans chapter 3. I hope that you were able to read over Romans chapter 3 beforehand. Romans chapter 3 is broken up into three major sections. The first section is Romans 3, 1 through 8. And in this section, Paul begins to address a particular issue in light of what he has just established in Romans chapter 2. We saw at the end of Romans chapter 2, Paul was closing up this point that both Jews and Gentiles will stand guilty before God. They will both stand unrighteous in light of the standard of God's holiness. And so what that does is that raises a question in the mind of every Jewish reader of the letter to the church at Rome. And Paul himself asks that question. He anticipates the asking of this question in light of what he has just established in Romans chapter 2. He says in Romans 3:1, "What advantage then is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision?" He says this in essence. He says, if Jews and Gentiles are both guilty, what is the point of being a Jew? There's really no difference in being a Jew and a Gentile if we both stand guilty before God on the day of judgment. And Paul responds to that and he says, there is much in every way. There is significance and value in being a Jew. And he points to this one very thing. He says, first of all, they have been entrusted with the very words of God. Paul is saying that Jews are stewards of the revelation of the one true and living God. Jewish people have been given and entrusted with the revelation of God, that information, that divine unveiling of truth that was embodied in the Holy Scriptures, that was communicated through Moses and the other prophets. So he says they are unique as a people group because they have and possess the information that God has spoken to humanity. So that Paul affirms the significance of being Jewish. Then he goes on, and Paul then goes to raise another issue. And this issue is of being Jewish and being righteous. So Paul goes on and he asks another question. He says, what if some, meaning Jewish people, what if they do not have faith? Now, here's the reason why Paul asks this question. Paul asks this question because the Jewish people believed that they were righteous just because they were Jewish. They were born an ethnic child of Abraham. They belonged to a particular race of people, and they believed that they were righteous just because they were born that race, because they had received the covenant sign of circumcision, and because they possessed the sacred writings, the revelation, the Holy Scriptures. So they believed that they were righteous. So Paul asks them this question in order to get them to think about what their major popular belief was, that being Jewish makes you righteous. Paul says, okay, so if that's the case, if being Jewish makes you righteous, he says, what if some do not have faith? So what if someone is born Jewish and they are circumcised and they know the Word of God because they have the Word of God, they were taught it, they were brought up in the Word of God, but yet they do not believe in the God of the Jews. They don't obey Him, they don't acknowledge Him, they don't walk with Him. Should God declare them righteous? What about those kinds of Jewish people? Is God forced to declare them righteous? It's a great point Paul makes, and then Paul goes on to answer that very question. He says, not at all. God cannot be faithful and He cannot be just if He declares an unrighteous person righteous on the basis of something other than His holy nature. And so this is what Paul says. He says, no, they are not righteous. A Jewish person is not righteous before God if they do not have faith in God. And God will condemn them for their unbelief. Now Paul goes on and he begins to have this antagonistic argument back and forth. Within his letter, he does this neat thing of raising an argument that a Jewish person might argue, might object to, might make this point in order to refute the major points that he's laying down. So, Paul says, I'm using a human argument. Now, here's the human argument that a Jewish person who doesn't like this answer might argue. They might say, well, if Jewish unrighteousness shows God's righteousness, then God shouldn't punish Jewish unbelief. So, hey, if God declares a Jewish person that doesn't believe in him righteous, that just shows how great God is, how merciful, how loving, how compassionate, how gracious God is. And Paul responds to that. And he says, no, God isn't going to look more gracious and more forgiving. He says, no, that's not possible. And then he goes on and he says that certainly not, verse 6. If that were so, how could God judge the world? If you have a Jewish person acting just like a grossly immoral Gentile person, how can God just forgive him on the basis of the fact that he's a Jew? And then for the same sins, cause a Gentile person to go and be punished. So Paul says, no, because God would have a double standard in judging. And as we already saw in Romans chapter 2, verse 11, that God does not show favoritism. God does not show partiality. God does not have two different standards of judging. His righteous and holy nature is the basis by which he will judge every single person. They are to be perfect as he is perfect. And so, God does not have a standard for a Jewish person and a different standard for a Gentile person. And Paul goes on to really crush this man-centered human argument, this wrong thinking. He goes even further to crush that by saying that this human thinking, having that type of an argument, he said it deserves condemnation. And then he goes further and he says, he's basically pointing to the fact that sin is never justified. He says, you are not given a license to sin so that God looks better. No, if you want God to look better, then change. Obey him. Walk in his way. Love him with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Do good to others. Be merciful. Be gracious. Act justly. Love mercy. Walk humbly with God. And this is how you will show off the grace of God. This is how you will show off the riches of God. Not by continuing to sin and saying, God will forgive me, to show how good he looks. No, we ought not do that. That's wrong thinking. Paul condemns that in these first 8 verses of Romans chapter 3. Then Paul moves on to the next section in Romans chapter 3, verse 9 through 20. And Paul's main overarching point here is that he is summing up all that he has just set down, everything that he has argued thus far, everything that he has established so far, that both Jews and Gentiles are guilty before God. He is summing all this up from Romans chapter 1, verse 18, all the way down here now to Romans chapter 3, verse 8. Paul's summing it all up now in these next verses, in this next section. And he says, in whole, he says, no one is righteous before a holy God. The Jews are guilty before him. The Gentiles are guilty before him. And he says this most clearly right here in verse 9, where he says, we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are under sin. So Paul makes this emphatic statement that both Jews and Gentiles are under sin, and they are in a condition of unrighteousness before God. Remember Paul's thesis. His thesis is that the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news about the person and work of Jesus Christ, is revealing a righteousness that comes forth from God. It is an alien righteousness. It is a righteousness outside of an individual that comes in and makes a person righteous. It comes from God, and it is received and applied to each individual by the means of faith. Not by righteous deeds, not by good works, not by conformity or observation of the law, but by faith, believing that this righteousness from God truly makes you righteous by faith. And now Paul says that both Jews and Gentiles are in need of this righteousness outside of themselves. Then Paul takes the next 10 verse or 8 verses here, 11 verses. He says from verses 10 through 18, Paul just quotes verse after verse, passage after passage from the Old Testament to support the point that he makes right here in verse 9, when he said that all are under sin. Paul quotes all these verses in order to show that even in the Old Testament it says that no one is righteous before God, not even one. Now, in the last 2 verses of this section, verses 19 and 20, Paul establishes the purpose of the law. Think about this. In the mind of a Jew, they're going to be asking the question, well, if having the law of God doesn't make you righteous, what is the point of the law of God? And Paul reveals that in these 2 verses, 19 and 20. The purpose of the law, he says, the law makes people more accountable to God. It's like a stop sign or a speed limit sign. If you're speeding and there's no sign, you didn't know. Oh, I didn't know I was speeding. I didn't know what the speed limit was. But if there's a sign there, that sign is now holding you accountable to your speed. And Paul says that the law makes the whole world accountable to God. Now when God says, why did you act that way? Why did you behave that way? When you say, I don't know, he will say, well, there was a sign. There was the law. And you broke the law knowing such things are wrong. So the law makes people accountable to God, and no one can be made righteous by obeying the law. This is a radical thought that Paul says here, that no one can become righteous or be made righteous by obeying the law. This is exactly what the Jews thought. They thought that if they obey all these ordinances and statutes and decrees that God had given, if they obeyed them, they would stand blameless before God. This is the exact thought of the Pharisees. And then you see in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, when Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' whole point in that sermon is that you will not be declared righteous. You will not be found in a condition of approval before God by obeying the law, because no one can keep the law. The law was not there to make you righteous. It can't make you righteous. So this is a radical thought in the mind of a Jew, that they can't be made righteous. You can't obey all of God's laws at all the time, at every moment in time. Paul makes another point in these last 2 verses in this section, verses 19 and 20. He says, if people were righteous, there would be no need for the law. Hey, if everybody always obeyed the speed limit, there would never be a speed limit sign. It'd be pointless because people are obeying it. They know it and they conform to it without it even being there in order to keep them that way. So, if people were righteous, God wouldn't have had to give the law. If people always told the truth, he'd never make a law that said, thou shalt not lie. If people never killed or murdered or stole, God would never have to make the commandments to reveal those things, saying that they shouldn't do those things. He would never have to put restraints on people who never went outside the bounds of his design. And lastly, the law's purpose is to affirm that people are unrighteous and sinful. Look at what it says in verse 20. It says, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. The law won't make you righteous. It can't make you righteous. And then he says in this last phrase, rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. Through the law, we actually understand, and it affirms that we are sinners, that we're sinful, that we're lawbreakers. Every time I sin, every time I lie, every time I cheat, every time I steal, every time I'm covetous or envious of another, the law only reminds me that what I'm doing is sinful. The law reminds me that I am falling short of God's righteous standard. These are radical thoughts to the mind of a first century Jew, to think that the precious Holy Scriptures, the ordinances, the Levitical laws which God had instituted through Moses, they don't actually make you righteous. They actually only show that you are unrighteous. And this is the point of this second section. Paul shows that no one is righteous before God. No, not even one.